The rope burned Katherine's wrists as the horses lurched forward, pulling her stumbling through the dust behind 3 mounted men who had just changed her life forever. She had been gathering eggs from the hen house on her family's small ranch outside Wichita, Kansas that morning in 1877, thinking about nothing more troubling than whether the bread she'd set to rise would be ready by noon, when rough hands had grabbed her from behind and a filthy cloth had covered her mouth. Now the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as her captors led her south, away from everything she knew, away from safety, away from home. Katherine Prescott was 22 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, preferring the honest work of running her father's ranch to the simpering and corset, cinching required to catch a husband in town. Her father had died 2 winters past, leaving her alone on the property with just old Samuel, the hired hand who was likely still out mending fences on the north pasture, unaware that anything had gone wrong. Her mother had passed when Katherine was just a girl, taken by fever, and she'd grown up strong and capable under her father's guidance. She could rope a steer, break a horse, and shoot straight enough to bring down a rabbit at 50 paces. But none of that had prepared her for this. The Rustlers, as she'd gathered from their gruff conversation, had been watching the ranch for days. They'd noted that she lived there with only one old man for protection, had seen that she was young and reasonably pretty despite the sun-browned skin and work-roughened hands. Women like her fetched good prices south of the border, they'd said, laughing as though they were discussing cattle or horses rather than a human life. The words had made her blood run cold. "Keep moving!" the one called Deacon snarled, yanking the rope when she stumbled over a rock. He was the ugliest of the 3, with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw and teeth that had gone brown from tobacco. The other 2 were younger, meaner, with the kind of casual cruelty that spoke of lives spent on the wrong side of the law. They had introduced themselves as Pike and Sutton, though she doubted those were their real names. Katherine bit back the cry of pain as her knees scraped against stone. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing her scream. Instead, she focused on memorizing the landscape, noting landmarks that might help if she found a chance to escape. The rolling prairie had given way to rougher country, with rocky outcroppings and scattered juniper trees. They were heading southwest, toward the border with Indian Territory, and beyond that, Mexico. Night fell before they stopped, and Katherine's feet were bleeding inside her worn boots. Deacon tied her to a scrubby tree while Pike built a fire, and Sutton tended the horses. They ate dried meat and hard biscuits, tossing her a piece of stale bread and a canteen of water that tasted of rust and leather. She forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need strength for whatever lay ahead. "Pretty thing like you will bring us at least $500, Deacon said, squatting near her with his tobacco-stained grin. "Maybe more if the bidding gets heated. There's men down in Monterey who pay good money for American women, ranchers wanting wives, or brothel owners wanting new girls. Either way, you're going to make us rich." Katherine stared at him with all the hatred she could summon. "You're monsters, all of you." Deacon laughed to sound like gravel scraping metal. "Maybe so, but we're rich monsters, or will be soon enough." He stood and walked back to the fire, leaving her alone in the darkness. She tested the ropes binding her wrists, but they were expertly tied. Even if she could free herself, where would she run? They were miles from any settlement, deep in country she didn't know. The temperature had dropped with the sunset, and she shivered in her thin cotton dress, the one she'd put on that morning without any thought that it might be her last day of freedom. Sleep came in fitful snatches, haunted by nightmares of auction blocks and strange hands reaching for her. When dawn broke gray and cold, she was exhausted and sore, her body a map of bruises and scrapes. The Rustlers roused themselves slowly, cursing the chill and the hardness of the ground. They gave her more stale bread and water, then untied her from the tree and hauled her to her feet. "We'll reach the border crossing by tomorrow night," Pike said, a thin man with nervous hands that were constantly checking his pistol. "Then it's smooth sailing into Mexico. Just 2 more days and we'll be counting our money." 2 more days. Katherine's heart sank. Once they crossed into Mexico, any chance of rescue would disappear. She had to find a way to escape before then, or accept whatever fate awaited her in that foreign land. They rode hard that day, pushing deeper into increasingly wild territory. The flat Kansas prairie had given way entirely to rougher country now, with red rock formations and deep ravines. Katherine saw deer watching from the hillsides, and once, circling high overhead, an eagle. The beauty of the landscape felt like mockery given her circumstances. By afternoon, they'd entered a region of pine-covered mountains that Katherine had only heard about in stories. The air smelled different here, sharp with resin and cold despite the season. Summer in Kansas meant heat and dust, but up in these heights the temperature remained almost pleasant. The horses picked their way along narrow trails that switchbacked up steep slopes, and Katherine found herself grateful for the slower pace, even as her body ached from 2 days of rough treatment. That evening, they made camp in a small clearing surrounded by tall ponderosa pines. A stream burbled nearby, clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. Deacon let Katherine drink her fill, and even allowed her to wash her face and hands, though he kept a tight grip on the rope that bound her. She savored the clean water, so different from the alkaline wells back home. "We're making good time," Sutton said, settling by the fire with a satisfied grunt. He was the largest of the three, barrel-chested and strong, which somehow made his participation in this crime even more disgusting to Katherine. A man that powerful should be protecting people, not preying on them. "Another day and a half, we'll be across the border. Then we head for Monterey and get our payment." "Assuming we don't run into trouble," Pike muttered, his nervous hands cleaning his pistol for the 3rd time that day. "These mountains are wild. Could be Indians, could be bandits, could be worse." "Could be nothing," Deacon said firmly. "Stop spooking yourself. We've got guns and we know how to use them. Ain't nobody going to bother 3 armed men." Katherine listened to this exchange while pretending to focus on the meager dinner they'd given her. So they were worried about threats in these mountains. That was interesting. It meant they weren't as confident as Deacon pretended. It also meant there might be someone out here who could help her, if she could just find a way to signal them. That night, tied again to a tree at the edge of their camp, Katherine stared up at the stars visible through the pine branches and prayed harder than she'd prayed since her father died. She prayed for deliverance, for strength, for some miracle that would spare her from the horror of being sold like livestock. The stars stared back, cold and distant, offering no answers. But someone had heard her, though she didn't know it yet. High above their camp, on a rocky outcropping that provided a view of the surrounding valleys and ridges, a man stood in the moonlight and watched the campfire below. Wyatt Xavier had been tracking this group of rustlers for 3 days, ever since he'd come across old Samuel frantically searching for his employer's daughter. The old man had been half mad with worry, having returned from fence mending to find Katherine gone and signs of struggle near the hen house. Wyatt had been in Wichita selling furs and buying supplies, preparing to return to his cabin higher in the mountains where he'd lived alone for the past 5 years. At 28, he'd long since grown accustomed to solitude, preferring the company of wildlife and weather to the complicated society of towns and cities. But he couldn't ignore an old man's desperate plea for help, especially not when the story involved a young woman being dragged off by human traffickers. He'd set out immediately, following their trail with the skill that came from years of living off the land. Tracking came as naturally to him as breathing, each broken twig and disturbed stone telling a story. The rustlers had been sloppy, confident that no one would pursue them into this wild country. They hadn't counted on someone like Wyatt. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad from years of chopping wood and hauling game. His arms were thick with muscle, his hands large and calloused from hard work. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, usually tied back with a leather cord, and a beard covered his jaw, though he kept it trimmed enough to avoid looking completely wild. His buckskin clothing was practical and well-made, decorated with simple beadwork he'd done himself during long winter nights. 2 knives hung from his belt, a rifle rested in the crook of his arm, and a pistol rode at his hip. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who lived in the mountains and answered to no one. Wyatt studied the camp below, counting 3 men and 1 woman. The woman was tied to a tree at the edge of the clearing, away from the fire. Even from this distance, he could see she was small and likely exhausted. Anger burned in his chest at the sight. He'd dealt with rustlers before, men who stole cattle or horses and drove them south to sell. But stealing a woman was different. That was evil of a kind that demanded justice. He couldn't simply charge into their camp with guns blazing. Even with the element of surprise, 3 against 1 were poor odds, and he had to consider the woman's safety. If shooting started, she could be hit or used as a shield. No, he needed to be smart about this. He needed to wait for the right moment. Wyatt settled into a comfortable position on the rocks, wrapping his heavy wool coat around himself against the mountain chill. He'd wait and watch, and when the opportunity came, he'd strike hard and fast. Those men had made a terrible mistake coming into his mountains with their stolen cargo. They just didn't know it yet. Dawn came slowly to the high country, light creeping down from the peaks to fill the valleys with soft gray luminescence. Wyatt had dozed lightly through the night, trusting his instincts to wake him if anything changed below. The Rustlers were stirring now, kicking their fire back to life and preparing for another day of travel. He watched as they freed the woman from the tree and allowed her to attend to her needs in the bushes, keeping the rope on her wrists, but giving her a measure of privacy. When she emerged, Wyatt got his first clear look at her in daylight. She was young, maybe early 20s, with dark blonde hair that had fallen from its pins and hung in tangles around her face. Even from a distance and in her disheveled state, he could see the strength in the way she held herself, the defiance in her posture despite her circumstances. She hadn't broken yet, hadn't given up. Good. That would make the rescue easier. The group headed out shortly after sunrise, continuing their southward journey along trails that would eventually lead them to the border. Wyatt followed at a distance, moving silently through the forest, using every bit of cover available. He knew these mountains better than most men knew their own parlors. Every ridge and valley, every stream and game trail was cataloged in his memory from years of wandering. Around midday, opportunity presented itself. The trail the Rustlers followed led through a narrow ravine with steep walls on either side. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and Wyatt moved quickly to get ahead of them. He climbed the ravine wall with the ease of long practice, finding handholds in rock that looked smooth from below. At the top, he positioned himself behind a large boulder that would provide cover and a good vantage point. His plan was simple. He'd shoot the horses out from under two of the men, then deal with the third before any of them could react. It wasn't sporting, perhaps, but this wasn't a duel between gentlemen. This was the rescue of an innocent woman from men who deserved no mercy. He waited, controlling his breathing, his finger resting lightly on the rifle's trigger. The sound of hoofbeats on stone echoed up from the ravine, growing louder. He could hear the men talking, their voices carrying clearly in the enclosed space. "I'll be glad when this job is done," Pike was saying, his nervous tone evident even at a distance. "Too many things can go wrong out here." "Nothing's going to go wrong," Deacon replied irritably. "Stop being such an old woman." They came into view below, riding single file through the narrow passage. Katherine was in the middle, her rope tied to Deacon's saddle horn. Sutton brought up the rear, looking more bored than alert. Wyatt took aim at Deacon's horse and fired in one smooth motion. The shot cracked like thunder in the confined space, and the horse went down instantly, dead before it hit the ground. Deacon tumbled from the saddle with a shout of surprise and pain. Before the other two could react, Wyatt had already chambered another round and fired again. Sutton's horse screamed and collapsed, pinning the big man's leg beneath its weight. Pike's horse reared in panic, and the sudden movement jerked Katherine forward. She hit the ground hard, the rope still connecting her to Deacon's fallen horse. Pike fought to control his mount, one hand on the reins and the other drawing his pistol, but he didn't know where the shots had come from, had no target to aim at. Wyatt stood up from behind his boulder, rifle trained on Pike. "Drop the gun," he called down, his voice carrying clear authority. "Do it now." Pike's head snapped up, his eyes wide with fear as he spotted Wyatt on the ridge above. For a moment he hesitated, and Wyatt could see him calculating odds. Then, wisely, he let his pistol fall to the ground. "Get off the horse," Wyatt ordered. "Slow and careful." Pike dismounted, his hands raised. Below him, Deacon was struggling to his feet, blood running from a gash on his forehead where he'd hit the ground. Sutton remained trapped under his dead horse, cursing and trying to free his leg. Wyatt scrambled down the ravine wall with practiced speed, his rifle never wavering from the men below. When he reached the bottom, he moved immediately to Katherine, who was staring at him with wide eyes that held equal parts hope and disbelief. "You're safe now," he said quietly, pulling out one of his knives to cut the rope binding her wrists. The blade was sharp, and the rope parted easily. Katherine gasped as blood rushed back into her hands, rubbing at the raw, rope-burned skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. "Thank you." Wyatt nodded once, then turned his attention back to the Rustlers. He moved to where Pike stood and quickly disarmed him of a second pistol hidden in his boot and a knife at his belt. Then he approached Deacon, who was swaying on his feet, clearly dazed from the fall. "Don't move," Wyatt warned, and something in his tone made the scarred man freeze. Wyatt relieved him of his weapons as well, tossing them far out of reach. That left Sutton, still pinned and cursing. "Get this damned horse off me," he bellowed. "My leg is broke." "Your leg's the least of your problems," Wyatt said coldly. He looked at Katherine, who had gotten to her feet and was standing unsteadily. "Can you handle a gun?" She nodded. "Yes, my father taught me." Wyatt handed her one of the confiscated pistols. "Keep it pointed at these two," he said, indicating Pike and Deacon. "If either of them moves, shoot them." Katherine took the weapon with both hands, steadying it despite her exhaustion. "I will," she said, and there was steel in her voice that made both Rustlers believe her. Wyatt moved to Sutton and the dead horse. With strength that seemed impossible, he gripped the horse's body and heaved, rolling it enough for Sutton to drag his leg free. The big man howled in pain, and Wyatt could see that the leg was indeed broken, bent at an unnatural angle below the knee. "You bastard," Sutton gasped, his face gray with shock and pain. "You broke my leg." "Your horse broke your leg," Wyatt corrected, taking Sutton's weapons as well. "I just shot the horse, and you're lucky I didn't shoot you." He gathered up all the confiscated firearms and moved them to where Pike's still living horse stood, ground-tied and nervous. The animal shied away at first, but Wyatt spoke softly to it and soon had it calmed enough to tie the weapons to the saddle. "What are you going to do with us?" Deacon asked, one hand pressed to his bleeding forehead. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by the fear of a man who knows he's at another's mercy. Wyatt considered the question. The nearest law was back in Wichita, days away. He could tie them up and leave them here, but that felt too much like murder by abandonment, especially with Sutton's broken leg. He could march them back to town himself, but that would take time and would mean subjecting Katherine to more days in their presence. "I'm going to tie you up," he said finally. "Then I'm going to take the lady somewhere safe. Once she's settled, I'll come back with a marshal to collect you. If you're smart, you'll still be here when I return. If you're not smart and you somehow get loose and run, I'll track you down, and what happens next will be a lot worse than a trial. Understand?" All three men nodded, even Sutton through his pain. Wyatt used their own ropes to bind them securely to trees, checking each knot with professional care. He left them their canteens and some food where they could reach it, more mercy than they deserved, but more than he'd be able to live with himself if he didn't. Then he caught Pike's horse and helped Katherine mount. "Can you ride?" he asked, looking up at her with concern. Now that the immediate danger had passed, he could see how exhausted she was, dark circles under her eyes and a pallor to her skin despite its sun-brown tone. "I can ride," she said, though her voice wavered, "but I don't think I can ride far today." Wyatt nodded. "We won't go far, just far enough to be away from them. I have a camp a few miles from here, a place I use when I'm hunting this area. We'll go there and you can rest." He mounted behind her, his large frame dwarfing her smaller one, and took the reins. The horse shifted under the double weight but accepted it. Wyatt guided them out of the ravine and up into higher country, away from the Rustlers and their curses and pleas. Katherine sagged back against his broad chest, unable to hold herself upright any longer. Wyatt wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her, feeling how she trembled with exhaustion and delayed shock. "It's all right," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "You're safe now. I've got you." And Katherine, who had been strong for 3 days, who had refused to break or beg or cry in front of her captors, finally let herself believe those words. Safe. She was safe. The tears came then, silent and unstoppable, soaking into the buckskin of the strange man's shirt as he carried her deeper into the mountains. Wyatt's hunting camp turned out to be a small but sturdy cabin tucked into a fold of the mountainside, surrounded by aspens that whispered in the breeze. It was a simple structure, just one room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn bed frame with a rope mattress, a table and chairs, and shelves holding supplies. But to Katherine, exhausted and traumatized, it looked like paradise. Wyatt helped her down from the horse and steadied her when her legs nearly buckled. "Easy," he said, his voice gentle despite his rough appearance. When did you last eat a real meal? Katherine had to think about it. 3 days ago, breakfast before they took me. His jaw tightened. Right. Food first, then rest. He guided her to one of the chairs and settled her there, then moved to the fireplace to build up a fire from the coals he'd left banked when he last departed. Soon flames were crackling, taking the chill from the cabin's interior. Katherine watched him move around the space with practiced efficiency, pulling out supplies and preparing food. Despite his size and obvious strength, he moved with surprising grace, no wasted motion. His hands were large but capable, whether building a fire or slicing venison for the pan. She found herself studying him, this stranger who had appeared like an avenging angel to save her. "What's your name?" she asked, realizing she didn't know who her rescuer was. He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Wyatt Xavier. I live up higher in these mountains most of the year, come into Wichita maybe twice a year for supplies. I was in town when I met old Samuel, looking for help finding you." "Samuel," Katherine breathed, relief flooding through her. "He's all right then? I was worried they might have hurt him." "He's fine. Worried sick about you, but fine." Wyatt set a pan of meat on the fire to cook, then filled a pot with water for coffee. "He said you run your ranch alone, just the two of you." "Since my father died, yes." Katherine's voice caught slightly on the word father. "It's not a big operation, just some cattle and horses, enough to get by. Samuel's too old to handle it all himself, so I do most of the work." She paused. "I suppose I'll lose it now. 3 days gone, maybe more before I get back. The animals won't have been tended." "Samuel will manage," Wyatt assured her. "And we'll get you home as soon as you're strong enough to travel. Tomorrow maybe, or the day after. It's only a 3-day ride back to Wichita from here if we push a little." The meat began to sizzle, filling the cabin with a savory aroma that made Katherine's stomach clench with hunger. When had food ever smelled so good? Wyatt served it up on tin plates, along with some of the hard biscuits that seemed to be a staple of outdoor cooking, and Katherine ate like she hadn't seen food in a week. The venison was tender and well-seasoned, the coffee strong and hot. She felt life returning to her body with each bite. Wyatt ate more slowly, watching her with concern in his dark eyes. When she finally pushed back from the table, full for the first time in days, he poured her more coffee and settled across from her. "Tell me what happened," he said, "from the beginning." So Katherine told him, starting with that morning 3 days ago when she'd gone out to gather eggs. She described the capture, the threats, the rough treatment, and the long forced march south. She told him about the Rustlers' plans to sell her in Mexico and their casual cruelty. As she spoke, she saw Wyatt's expression darken, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "They deserve worse than what they'll get from the law," he said when she finished. "But the law is what they'll get. I'll make sure of that." Katherine looked at him across the rough table, this mountain man who had saved her life. "Why did you come after me? You didn't know me. You could have just ignored Samuel's plea and gone back to your cabin." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "Because I couldn't live with myself if I'd left you to that fate when I had the skill to prevent it. And because," he paused, something shifting in his expression, "because I know what it's like to feel helpless and alone." There was a story there, Katherine sensed, something painful in Wyatt's past that had driven him to these mountains in this solitary life. But she didn't press. He had earned the right to his privacy, and she was too exhausted to do more than acknowledge the connection between them with a nod. "Thank you," she said again, putting all the emotion she felt into those 2 simple words. "Thank you for saving me." Wyatt's expression softened. "You're welcome. Now you need to rest. Take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor." Katherine started to protest, but he cut her off with a gentle but firm shake of his head. "You've been through hell. You need a proper place to sleep. I've slept on worse floors than this, believe me." Too tired to argue further, Katherine accepted. Wyatt turned his back politely while she removed her boots and lay down on the bed, still fully dressed. The rope mattress was surprisingly comfortable, and the blankets he pulled over her were warm and smelled of pine and wood smoke. She was asleep almost before he finished tucking them around her. Wyatt stood looking down at her for a long moment, taking in her sleeping face. Even exhausted and bruised, she was pretty, with high cheekbones and a strong jawline that spoke of determination. Her hair spread across the pillow like dark gold, and one hand curled near her face in a gesture that was almost childlike. Something stirred in his chest, an emotion he hadn't felt in the 5 years since he'd fled to these mountains. Protectiveness, yes, but something more, something that frightened him with its intensity. He turned away, banking the fire for the night and spreading his bedroll on the floor. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, his dreams were full of golden hair and grateful eyes. Katherine woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was, and then memory flooded back. The kidnapping, the rescue, the mountain man named Wyatt who had saved her life. She sat up slowly, wincing at the aches and pains that mapped her body. Her wrists were bandaged, she noticed, the rope burns cleaned and wrapped while she slept. Wyatt must have done it. The thought of his large, careful hands tending her injuries made something warm bloom in her chest. "Good morning," Wyatt said from the fireplace, not turning around. "I heard you stirring. Breakfast is almost ready." Katherine stood and moved to the table, her body protesting every movement. But the night's rest had done her good. She felt more like herself, less like the terrified captive of the past 3 days. Wyatt served up bacon and eggs from his stores, along with more of those ubiquitous biscuits. As they ate, he outlined his plan. "We'll rest here today. Give you time to recover your strength. Tomorrow we'll start back toward Wichita. I'll take you as far as your ranch, make sure you're safe, then I'll gather up a marshal and we'll come back for the Rustlers." 3 days back, Katherine said, doing the math in her head. "That's 6 days more before you can get back to them. What if they escape?" "They won't," Wyatt said with certainty. "Sutton can't walk on that leg, and the other 2 won't leave him. Thieves' honor or something like it. And even if they do somehow get loose, I'll track them. I'll track them to the ends of the earth if I have to." The intensity in his voice made Katherine shiver, but not with fear. With something else entirely. She studied him in the morning light, really looking at him for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably only a few years older than her own 22 years. His face beneath the beard was strong and handsome, with high cheekbones and a straight nose. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black, and held both intelligence and sadness. The long dark hair made him look wild, but there was nothing uncivilized about the way he conducted himself. He was educated, she realized. His speech, though economical, was grammatically correct and his vocabulary suggested learning. "Who are you, Wyatt Xavier?" she asked softly. "Really?" Wyatt looked at her, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed and set down his coffee cup. "I was a soldier," he said. "Cavalry. Fought in the Indian Wars after the rebellion ended. Saw things, did things that I'm not proud of. Things that haunt me still. 5 years ago I couldn't take it anymore. Couldn't take the killing, the orders, the waste of it all. So I left. Came up into these mountains and built myself a life away from all that." "Desertion?" Katherine asked, though without judgment. "My term of service was up," Wyatt said. "I left legally, honorably even, with papers to prove it. But it still felt like running away. Still does sometimes." He looked out the window at the mountains rising beyond. "These peaks don't judge, though. They don't care what I've done or haven't done. They just are. I find that comforting." Katherine reached across the table and laid her hand on his. The gesture surprised them both, but she didn't pull away. "Thank you for telling me. And for what it's worth, I don't think leaving makes you a coward. I think it makes you brave. It takes courage to walk away from a bad situation and build something new." Wyatt turned his hand over beneath hers, his palm rough and warm. For a moment they sat like that, connected across the rough wooden table, 2 people who had each been alone finding unexpected understanding in each other. Then Wyatt cleared his throat and gently withdrew his hand, though Katherine could see the reluctance in the gesture. "We should tend to your injuries properly. I bandaged your wrists last night, but there might be other hurts that need attention." Katherine's face flushed slightly. "I have some bruises, but nothing serious. The wrist burns are the worst of it. You did a good job with them." "I've had practice patching myself up over the years," Wyatt said with a slight smile. "You learn basic doctoring when you live alone in the wilderness." They spent the rest of that day in companionable conversation, sharing stories of their lives. Katherine told Wyatt about growing up on the ranch, about her father teaching her to ride and rope and shoot. She talked about her mother's death and how it had shaped her, made her strong but also wary of depending on others. She described the hard work of keeping a ranch running and the satisfaction she found in that work despite its difficulties. Wyatt, in turn, shared more of his past. He'd grown up in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher and a farmer. He'd been educated well, had planned to become a teacher himself, but the war had interrupted those plans. He joined up young, full of idealism, and had emerged from the experience older and disillusioned. The years in the cavalry had finished the job, stripping away his naivete and replacing it with hard knowledge of what men were capable of doing to each other. "Do you ever miss it?" Katherine asked, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the cabin floor. "Civilization, I mean. People, society, all of that." Wyatt considered the question. "Sometimes. I miss music. Real music, played by skilled musicians. I miss books, more books than I can carry on my back. I miss conversation with people who have ideas and thoughts beyond survival." He looked at her. "But mostly I don't miss it. The peace here, the solitude, is worth what I've given up." "What about family? Don't you miss having family?" A shadow crossed Wyatt's face. "My parents passed while I was in the cavalry. Disease took my mother. A farming accident took my father. I have no siblings, no wife or children. The army was my family for a while, but that's a cold kind of belonging. So no, I don't miss family because I haven't had one for a long time." The loneliness in those words struck Katherine deeply. She understood it, had felt it herself since her father died. The isolation of living on that ranch with only old Samuel for company, the way the days blurred together without anyone to share them with. Maybe that was why she'd been so resistant to the idea of marriage. None of the men in Wichita had seemed like they could understand that loneliness, let alone fill it. But Wyatt understood. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. He knew what it meant to be alone, and he'd made peace with it, or had tried to at least. "Tell me about the mountains," she said, steering the conversation to safer ground. "Tell me about your life up here." Wyatt's expression lightened, and he began to describe his existence in the high country. He talked about hunting and trapping, about the rhythms of the seasons and how he moved with them. He described watching bear cubs play in spring meadows and elk herds migrating in the fall. He talked about the terrible beauty of winter storms and the almost holy silence that followed them. As he spoke, Katherine could hear the love in his voice, the deep connection he'd formed with this wild place. She found herself drawn not just to his words, but to the man himself. There was strength in Wyatt, obvious in his muscled frame and capable hands, but also gentleness. He'd handled her injuries with care, had given her his bed without hesitation, had shared his food and his stories as though she were a valued guest rather than a burden. And beneath the rugged exterior, she sensed depth, intelligence, and a capacity for feeling that he kept carefully guarded. Night fell, and they ate dinner by firelight, Wyatt's cooking simple but satisfying. Afterward, Katherine insisted on washing the dishes while he saw to the horse. When he returned, she'd made up his bedroll on the floor and was preparing to take the bed again. "Tomorrow we start back," Wyatt said, checking the fire one last time. "It's a long ride, but we can take it at whatever pace you need. Your health is more important than speed." Katherine nodded, then hesitated. "Wyatt, when we get back to Wichita, to my ranch, will you stay? For a while at least? I'd like to repay your kindness, and Samuel would want to thank you properly." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I'll stay long enough to see you safely home and to fetch the marshal. After that, I should get back to my cabin. I've been gone longer than I planned already." "Of course," Katherine said, trying to hide her disappointment. What had she expected? That he'd stay forever? This solitary man who'd found peace in isolation? That he'd give up the life he'd built for a woman he barely knew? "I understand." But as she lay in bed that night, listening to Wyatt's quiet breathing from his place on the floor, Katherine couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening between them. Something that had started with a rescue but was becoming something more. Something that might be worth fighting for if she was brave enough. The journey back to Wichita began at dawn. Wyatt had only one horse, so they rode double as they had on the way to the cabin, Katherine seated in front with Wyatt's arms around her to hold the reins. The intimacy of the position was impossible to ignore, his broad chest solid against her back, his warmth surrounding her like a shield. They traveled steadily but without urgency, mindful of Katherine's still healing body and Wyatt's desire to avoid attracting attention from any other dangerous characters who might be lurking in these wild lands. The route took them through some of the most beautiful country Katherine had ever seen, up over high passes where snow still clung to northern slopes even in summer, and down through valleys filled with wildflowers. Wyatt proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out landmarks and wildlife, sharing knowledge he'd accumulated over his years in the mountains. He showed her the signs of elk passage, the scratch marks bears left on trees, the different types of edible plants that grew at various elevations. Katherine absorbed it all, fascinated by this world she'd never known existed. They stopped frequently to rest, Wyatt always finding good places to camp with water nearby and natural shelter. He treated her with unfailing courtesy and consideration, making sure she was comfortable before seeing to his own needs. At night he laid out their bedrolls at opposite sides of the fire, maintaining a proper distance, though Katherine found herself wishing he wouldn't. On the second day of travel, they crested a ridge and looked down at the prairie spreading endlessly to the east, a sea of grass rippling in the wind. Somewhere out there, several days' ride distant, was Wichita and Katherine's ranch, home, or what passed for home. Looking at it from this height, with the mountains at her back and Wyatt's steady presence beside her, Katherine felt something shift inside her. That ranch had been home because it was all she'd had. But now, having seen these mountains, having met this man, it felt less like home and more like a place she happened to live. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Wyatt said softly, following her gaze. "The way the land just goes on and on." "It is," Katherine agreed. "But lonely too, all that space and so few people." "Some of us prefer it that way," Wyatt reminded her, though his tone was gentle. Katherine turned in the saddle to look at him. "Do you really? Prefer to be alone, I mean? Or is it just safer than risking connection?" The question was bold, perhaps too bold, but these days together had created a strange intimacy between them. Wyatt held her gaze, and she could see him wrestling with how to answer. "Maybe both," he said finally. "I've seen what people do to each other, Katherine, the cruelty we're capable of. Being alone means not having to witness that anymore, not having to participate in it. But it also means not experiencing the good things people can give each other," Katherine countered. "Kindness, friendship, love." "Love," Wyatt repeated, and something painful crossed his face. "Love is the most dangerous thing of all. It gives someone the power to destroy you." "Or the power to make you whole," Katherine said quietly. "It's a risk, yes, but maybe it's one worth taking." Wyatt didn't answer, just urged the horse forward down the slope toward the prairie below, but Katherine felt like something important had been said, seeds planted that might, if given time, grow into something real. That night they camped at the edge of the foothills where mountains gave way to grassland. Wyatt caught fish from a nearby stream and cooked them over the fire, along with some wild onions he'd gathered. They ate as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took Katherine's breath away. "I'm going to miss this," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "When I'm back at the ranch dealing with chores and cattle, I'm going to miss these mountains and this freedom." "You could always come back," Wyatt offered. "Visit, I mean. The mountains aren't going anywhere." Katherine looked at him across the fire. "Would you want me to? Visit, I mean." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Wyatt's jaw tightened, and she could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression. Finally, he spoke. "Yes," he said simply. "I would want that." It wasn't a declaration of love or even of affection, but it was more than Katherine had dared hope for, more than Wyatt had probably intended to reveal. She smiled, a genuine expression of joy that made Wyatt's breath catch. "Then I will," she promised. "Once everything is settled, once the ranch is taken care of, I'll come back for a visit." They didn't talk much after that, but the silence was comfortable, full of possibilities neither of them was quite ready to name. When they finally settled into their separate bedrolls, Katherine lay awake for a long time, thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. She'd been kidnapped, nearly sold into slavery, and somehow it had led her to this man, this moment, this feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. And she realized she wasn't afraid of that change. She was ready for it. The third day of travel brought them down into proper prairie country where the grass grew tall and the horizon stretched unbroken in all directions. They saw other travelers now, the occasional wagon or rider on distant trails, signs that they were approaching civilization. Wyatt became more watchful, his hand never far from his rifle, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Are you worried about something?" Katherine asked, noticing his increased vigilance. "Just being careful," Wyatt said. "We're getting closer to areas where bad men operate. Outlaws, bandits, men like the ones who took you. I won't let anything happen to you, but it pays to be alert." His protectiveness warmed Katherine, even as it made her aware of the dangers still lurking between them and safety. She pressed back against him slightly, drawing comfort from his solid presence, and felt his arm tighten around her waist in response. They stopped for a midday break near a small creek, letting the horse drink and graze while they rested in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Wyatt unpacked some jerky and hardtack for them to eat, apologizing for the rough fare. "When we get to your ranch, I'll cook you a proper meal," Katherine promised, "something that doesn't come from a saddlebag." "I'd like that," Wyatt said, and the warmth in his voice made Katherine's heart skip. They were sitting close together, their shoulders nearly touching, and Katherine found herself acutely aware of every point of almost contact between them. She wanted to lean into him, to close that last bit of distance, but she held back. Despite the connection growing between them, despite the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, Wyatt had maintained careful physical boundaries. She wouldn't push past them unless he gave her clear invitation. But then Wyatt reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You're healing well," he said softly, his eyes on the fading bruise at her temple. "The swelling is almost gone." Katherine's breath caught. "Thanks to your care," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. They were so close now, close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could count the small scars that marked his face. Close enough that if she leaned forward just a little, their lips would meet. She saw the same awareness in Wyatt's expression, saw desire war with restraint. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Wyatt slowly withdrew his hand and stood, breaking the spell. "We should keep moving. Want to make good distance before dark." Katherine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. But as Wyatt helped her mount the horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary, she thought she saw regret in his eyes. He wanted this, wanted her, as much as she wanted him. He was just afraid to take it, afraid of the connection, the vulnerability it would require. She would have to be patient, would have to show him that love didn't mean destruction, that opening his heart wouldn't lead to the kind of pain he'd experienced before. It wouldn't be easy. But then, nothing worth having ever was. They reached Katherine's ranch late in the afternoon of the 5th day after leaving Wyatt's hunting cabin. As the familiar buildings came into view, Katherine felt a confusing mix of emotions. Relief to be home, yes, but also a strange sadness that this journey with Wyatt was ending. Old Samuel came running from the barn, his weathered face breaking into a huge smile when he saw Katherine. "Miss Katherine, thank the Lord. We'd about given up hope." Katherine slid down from the horse into Samuel's embrace, hugging the old man tightly. "I'm all right, Samuel. Thanks to Wyatt here. He saved me from the Rustlers." Samuel turned to Wyatt, who had dismounted and was standing quietly nearby. The old man gripped Wyatt's hand with both of his own. "I can't thank you enough, sir. Can't begin to repay what you've done. If there's anything you need, anything at all, you just name it." "Just doing what was right," Wyatt said, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Miss Prescott was lucky. I happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Lucky nothing," Samuel said firmly. "You tracked those devils for days, fought them, brought her home safe. That's heroism, not luck." Katherine saw Wyatt's discomfort increasing and intervened. "Samuel, could you see to the horse? And maybe heat some water for baths? I'm sure we could both use one after 5 days of travel." Of course, Samuel said, taking the horse's reins. "I'll get right on it. And Miss Katherine, I kept up with the chores as best I could. Animals are all tended, house is clean. Didn't want you coming home to a mess." "You're a treasure, Samuel," Katherine said warmly. She turned to Wyatt. "Come inside. I'll fix us something to eat while Samuel works on the water." The ranch house was small but comfortable, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, 2 bedrooms, and a loft where Samuel slept. Katherine's father had built it with his own hands, and every board and nail held memories. She found herself seeing it through Wyatt's eyes, wondering what he thought of this modest dwelling compared to his mountain cabin. But Wyatt looked around with apparent approval. "It's a good house," he said. "Solid. Well maintained. Your father knew what he was doing." "He did," Katherine agreed, moving to the stove to build up the fire. "Taught me everything, too. How to keep a house, work a ranch, live independent. I miss him every day." She pulled out flour and eggs, butter and milk, and began making biscuits from scratch. Her hands moved with practiced ease, mixing and kneading, while Wyatt sat at the kitchen table and watched. There was something intimate about the domestic scene, something that made Katherine's heart ache with longing for more moments like this. "Tell me what you're going to do now," Wyatt said. "After I fetch the marshal and deal with the Rustlers, what's next for you?" Katherine shaped the biscuits and slid them into the oven before answering. "Same as before, I suppose. Work the ranch, tend the animals, try to keep this place going. It's not an easy life, but it's mine. My father left it to me, and I won't let it go without a fight." "You're a strong woman," Wyatt observed. "Stronger than most men I've known." "Had to be," Katherine said, starting on a pot of stew with vegetables from the root cellar and salted beef. "World doesn't give women much choice. You're either strong or you're a victim." "That's a harsh view." "It's a realistic one," Katherine countered. "You think those Rustlers would have taken me if I'd had a husband, sons, if I'd been safely tucked into a role society approved of? They took me because I was alone, because I was vulnerable. Well, I won't be vulnerable again. I'll work this ranch, and I'll defend it, and anyone who tries to take it or me will regret it." The fierce determination in her voice made Wyatt smile slightly. "I believe you. But Katherine, being strong doesn't mean you have to be alone. There's strength in partnership, too." Katherine looked at him, really looked at him, trying to read what lay beneath those words. Was he talking about himself, about them, or just making philosophical observations? Before she could respond, Samuel came in to announce that the bathwater was ready, breaking the moment. Katherine bathed first in the big copper tub in her bedroom, luxuriating in the hot water and the soap that actually smelled like lavender instead of lye. She washed her hair 3 times, scrubbing away the dust and fear of the past week. When she emerged, clean and dressed in fresh clothes, she felt more like herself than she had since this nightmare began. Wyatt bathed next, and when he came out with his hair wet and slicked back, his face clean-shaven for the first time, Katherine's breath caught. Without the beard, he looked younger, almost vulnerable, and devastatingly handsome. His strong jaw and full lips had been hidden by all that hair, and now she couldn't stop looking at them, imagining what they might feel like against hers. They ate the meal she'd prepared, all 3 of them together at the kitchen table. Samuel kept up a running commentary about ranch business, all the small dramas and problems that had occurred in Katherine's absence. She listened and asked questions, slipping back into the familiar role of ranch owner. But part of her attention never left Wyatt, sitting across from her, eating her food, looking like he belonged there. After dinner, Samuel excused himself to bed, leaving Katherine and Wyatt alone. They moved to the porch, sitting on the steps and watching the stars come out. The prairie stretched before them, peaceful under the moon's silver light. "I'll leave at first light tomorrow," Wyatt said quietly. "Ride to Wichita, fetch the marshal, and go collect those Rustlers. Should be back here in about 5 or 6 days, depending on how things go." "And then you'll leave," Katherine said, not quite managing to keep the sadness from her voice. "Go back to your mountains." "Yes," Wyatt said, though he sounded less certain than he had before. Katherine took a breath, gathering her courage. "What if you didn't? What if you stayed here, at least for a while?" Wyatt turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Katherine, I can't. My life is in the mountains. I don't belong here, in civilization." "Don't you?" Katherine challenged. "You've been here 2 days and you fit in perfectly. Samuel likes you. The ranch could use a man with your skills, and I—" She trailed off, uncertain how to finish that sentence. "And you what?" Wyatt asked softly. Katherine met his eyes. And I don't want you to go. These past few days with you have been the happiest I've been since my father died, maybe even before that. You understand me in a way no one else ever has. And I hope, that maybe you feel the same way about me." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I do. God help me, Katherine. I do feel the same way. You've gotten under my skin, into my head, into my heart. But that's exactly why I need to leave. Because I'm not the man you need. I'm broken, damaged from the things I've seen and done. You deserve someone whole, someone who can give you everything you deserve." "You're not broken," Katherine said fiercely. "You're hurt, maybe, scarred, but not broken. And you've given me more in these few days than anyone else has given me in years. You've given me safety, kindness, understanding. You've made me feel seen and valued. How can you think that's not enough?" "Because what happens when the nightmares come?" Wyatt asked, and now there was real anguish in his voice. "When I wake up screaming from dreams of war and death, when the memories get too heavy and I need to be alone to bear them. I've built a life in those mountains where I can manage all that. But here, with you, I couldn't hide. I couldn't pretend I'm normal. And I don't want you to see me like that, to see the worst parts of me." Katherine reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Wyatt, I've seen you save my life at great risk to your own. I've seen you care for me when I was hurt and vulnerable. I've seen your gentleness and your strength, your intelligence and your kindness. Don't you think I can handle seeing your struggles too? Don't you think I'm strong enough to stand beside you through the hard times as well as the good?" "I don't doubt your strength," Wyatt said. "I doubt my own. I doubt whether I'm brave enough to let someone in to risk caring that much." "Then be brave," Katherine urged. "Take the risk. Stay with me. Let's see what we could build together." Wyatt looked down at their joined hands, his thumb stroking over her knuckles. If I try this, I'm going to fail you. I'm going to disappoint you." "Maybe," Katherine conceded. "Or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll surprise yourself. Maybe we'll both surprise ourselves." She squeezed his hand. "I'm not asking for promises of forever right now, Wyatt. I'm just asking you to stay a little longer, to give us, a chance." The silence stretched between them, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Katherine held her breath, waiting for his answer, hoping with everything in her that he'd say yes. Finally, Wyatt spoke. "I'll stay. At least until after we deal with the Rustlers and I know you're truly safe. After that, we'll see." "But Katherine," he turned to look at her, his eyes intense, "if I do this, if I try to build something with you, you have to promise me that if it's not working, if I'm making you unhappy, you'll tell me. You'll let me go. Can you promise me that?" "I can promise to tell you if I'm unhappy," Katherine said carefully, "but I won't promise to let you go. If we're unhappy, we'll work on it together. That's what partnership means, Wyatt. You don't run at the first sign of trouble. You stay and you fight for what you're building." A slow smile spread across Wyatt's face, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, making him look younger and almost carefree. "You're a stubborn woman, Katherine Prescott." "I am," she agreed, smiling back, "and you might as well get used to it because I'm not changing." "I wouldn't want you to," Wyatt said. And then, so slowly that Katherine had time to pull away if she wanted to, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative, as though he was afraid she might shatter under too much pressure, but Katherine had no intention of shattering. She pressed closer, her free hand coming up to cup his bearded jaw, and kissed him back with all the emotion she'd been holding inside. Desire and relief, hope and joy, all of it poured into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. "I'm still scared," he admitted quietly. "So am I," Katherine whispered back. "But let's be scared together." Wyatt left at dawn to ride to Wichita, but he promised to be back as quickly as possible. Katherine watched him go, her hand raised in farewell, then turned to the business of running her ranch. Samuel was full of questions about Wyatt, about what had happened in the mountains, about whether the mountain man would really return. Katherine answered as honestly as she could, though she kept the kiss in the conversation that had led up to it to herself. That was too new, too precious, to share yet. The days passed slowly. Katherine threw herself into work, repairing fences and tending animals, checking water sources and planning for the fall roundup. The physical labor felt good, grounding her in the familiar routines, even as her mind wandered constantly to Wyatt. Was he safe? Had he found the Rustlers still where they'd left them? Would he change his mind about staying and simply disappear back into his mountains? On the 6th day, she was mending a section of fence when she saw riders approaching from the west. Her hand went automatically to the rifle she now carried everywhere, but then she recognized Wyatt's distinctive figure among them. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her knees weak. As they drew closer, she saw that Wyatt was accompanied by a marshal and 3 other men, along with the 3 rustlers, bound and looking considerably worse for wear. Deacon's face bore fresh bruises. Pike looked like he hadn't slept in days, and Sutton was slumped in his saddle, his broken leg clearly causing him agony. Katherine met them in the yard, her eyes locked on Wyatt. He looked tired but unharmed, and when he saw her, something in his expression softened. The moment he dismounted, she was in his arms, propriety forgotten. "You came back," she breathed against his chest. "Of course I came back," Wyatt said, holding her close. "I promised I would." The marshal, a grizzled man named Thompson, cleared his throat. "Miss Prescott, I need to get your statement about what these men did. Then we'll be taking them to stand trial in Wichita." Katherine reluctantly pulled away from Wyatt and gave her statement, recounting the kidnapping and the rustlers' plans to sell her across the border. The marshal took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, while his deputies kept watch over the prisoners. When she finished, Thompson nodded with satisfaction. "That should be more than enough to hang them. Begging your pardon for the bluntness, madam. They'll face justice. You have my word on that." "Thank you, Marshal," Katherine said. She looked at the rustlers, these men who had stolen her and planned to sell her into slavery, and felt a complicated mix of emotions. Anger, certainly, and a desire for justice, but also pity for whatever had led them to become the kind of men who could do such things. Deacon met her eyes and for a moment looked like he might speak. Then he just looked away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The marshal and his men prepared to leave, securing their prisoners for the journey back to town. Before they rode out, Thompson approached Wyatt. "The town is grateful for what you did, Mr. Xavier. Not many men would have tracked those criminals so far or fought them alone. If you ever need anything from the law in Wichita, you just let me know." "Appreciate that, Marshal," Wyatt said, shaking the man's hand. And then they were gone, riding east toward town with their prisoners in tow, leaving Katherine and Wyatt alone in the yard. Samuel had diplomatically disappeared into the barn, giving them privacy. "So," Katherine said, suddenly shy. "You're back." "I'm back," Wyatt confirmed, "for as long as you'll have me." "That might be a very long time," Katherine warned. "I'm counting on it," Wyatt replied, and pulled her back into his arms. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Katherine's life. Wyatt proved to be an invaluable help on the ranch, his strength and skills making work that had been difficult for her and Samuel much easier. He repaired the barn roof that had been leaking, rebuilt a section of fence that had been on the verge of collapse, and gentled a wild horse that Katherine had been trying to break for months. But more than his physical contributions, it was his presence that transformed the ranch. He brought laughter back into the house, into Katherine's life. His dry humor surprised her daily, and she found herself smiling more than she had in years. They worked side by side during the day, and in the evenings they sat on the porch and talked for hours, sharing dreams and fears, hopes and memories. Wyatt did have nightmares, as he'd warned. Katherine would hear him thrashing and crying out in the night, trapped in whatever horrors his mind conjured from his past. The first time it happened, she went to him despite his earlier warnings, shaking him gently awake and holding him while he shook with the aftermath of terror. He'd been embarrassed, had tried to pull away, but she'd held firm. "I told you," she'd said quietly. "We face things together. That includes the nightmares." After that, he stopped fighting her comfort. When the dreams came, she was there, and gradually they became less frequent, less intense. The unconditional acceptance, the knowledge that she wouldn't judge him or turn away, seemed to have a healing effect stronger than any medicine. Samuel watched their growing relationship with approval, often finding excuses to leave them alone together. The old man had been worried about Katherine living out here alone, and seeing her with Wyatt clearly eased his mind. More than once, Katherine caught him smiling at them with grandfatherly satisfaction. About 2 months after Wyatt's return, he rode into Wichita to sell some furs and buy supplies. He came back with more than just flour and coffee. As they sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice uncertain in a way it rarely was anymore, "about the future, about what I want my life to look like. And Katherine, I can't imagine it without you in it. I know I'm not perfect. I know I come with baggage and problems. But if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond. Nothing fancy, but beautiful in its understated elegance. Katherine's eyes filled with tears. Are you asking me to marry you, Wyatt Xavier?" "I am," he confirmed. "Katherine Prescott, will you marry me?" "Yes," Katherine said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Wyatt slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her, deep and long and full of promise, and Katherine thought her heart might burst from happiness. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony in Wichita, with Samuel standing as witness and half the town turning out to celebrate. The story of Katherine's kidnapping and Wyatt's heroic rescue had spread through the community, and people were genuinely happy to see them find love in the aftermath of trauma. The wedding night in the little ranch house that was now truly their home was everything Katherine had dreamed of and more. Wyatt was gentle and passionate, attentive to her needs, making her first time a memory of pleasure rather than pain. Afterward, lying in his arms in the bed they would now share, Katherine felt completely at peace. "I love you," she said into the darkness. "I know we haven't said it before, but I need you to know. I love you, Wyatt." "I love you too," Wyatt replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I thought I could ever love anyone. You've given me a life I never expected to have, Katherine. You've given me a home, a purpose, a reason to face each day. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." "You already deserve me," Katherine assured him, "just by being exactly who you are." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. They worked the ranch together, building it up and expanding their herd. Wyatt's knowledge of the land and animals, combined with Katherine's business sense and determination, made them formidable partners. Samuel continued to help, though he did less of the heavy work now, content to let the younger couple shoulder most of the burden. About a year after their wedding, Katherine realized she was pregnant. The morning sickness had been her first clue, followed by the missed monthly courses and the strange new tenderness in her breasts. When she told Wyatt, he had actually shouted with joy, spinning her around despite her protests that he might make her dizzy. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying, as though he couldn't quite believe it. "We're going to be parents." "You're going to be a wonderful father," Katherine assured him, cupping his face in her hands. "I've seen how gentle you are with the animals, how patient. Our child will be so lucky to have you." The pregnancy wasn't easy. Katherine suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months and then exhaustion as she grew larger. But Wyatt was there through all of it, taking over more of her chores, rubbing her aching back, fetching her strange food cravings at odd hours. His attentiveness and care made even the hardest days bearable. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1879, arriving after a long and difficult labor that left Katherine exhausted but elated. Wyatt held the baby with such tenderness, such awe, that Katherine fell in love with him all over again. They named him James, after Katherine's father, with the middle name Daniel after Wyatt's father. Little James was healthy and strong, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. He transformed their lives completely, filling the house with crying and laughter and the indescribable joy that comes with new life. Wyatt took to fatherhood with surprising ease, despite his earlier fears that he wouldn't know how. He was patient with the baby's cries, gentle with the midnight feedings, devoted in a way that made Katherine's heart swell. She'd watch him walking the floor with James, singing old army songs in a soft voice, and think about how far they'd both come from those desperate days when she'd been a captive and he'd been a lonely mountain man. Samuel doted on the baby too, appointed himself honorary grandfather, and spent hours carving toys and telling stories. The old man seemed to grow younger with James in the house, energized by the child's presence. As James grew from baby to toddler, Katherine and Wyatt's love deepened and matured. They had their disagreements, certainly. Wyatt could be stubborn, and Katherine had a temper. But they'd learned how to fight fair, how to listen to each other, how to find compromise. The foundation of love and respect they'd built was strong enough to weather any storm. When James was 3, Katherine became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, as though her body remembered what to do. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1882, a tiny thing with blonde hair and Wyatt's serious expression. They named her Sarah, and she completed their family in a way Katherine hadn't even known was missing. The ranch prospered under their joint management. They expanded the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper parlor. They increased their herd and started breeding horses as well as cattle. Wyatt's reputation as a horse trainer spread through the territory, and people came from miles around to buy animals he'd worked with. But despite their success and growth, they never forgot where they'd started. Every year on the anniversary of Katherine's rescue, they would ride out to the foothills where Wyatt had first taken her to safety. They'd camp there overnight, just the 2 of them, while Samuel watched the children, and they'd remember. "Do you ever regret it?" Katherine asked one such night, lying beside her husband under the stars. "Giving up your solitary life in the mountains for all this chaos?" Wyatt pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Never, not once. The mountains were beautiful, but they were empty. You filled all those empty spaces inside me, Katherine. You and the children, the ranch, the life we've built together. This is what I was missing all those years. I just didn't know it." "I love you," Katherine said simply. "I'll love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that." "And I love you," Wyatt replied. "You're my miracle, the answer to prayers I was too stubborn to pray. Everything good in my life comes from that day I decided to track down your kidnappers. Best decision I ever made." Years passed, marked by the changing of seasons and the growth of their children. James grew into a tall, serious boy who loved the ranch and showed every sign of being as capable with animals as his father. Sarah was more spirited, always getting into mischief, but with a good heart and her mother's determination. Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep when James was 10 and Sarah 7. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch he'd helped build, and Katherine grieved for the old man who'd been like a second father to her. But she was grateful too, grateful that he'd lived to see her happy, to know her children, to witness the full flowering of the life she and Wyatt had created. They hired new help as the ranch grew, good men who respected Wyatt's leadership and Katherine's business sense. The Prescott Xavier Ranch became known throughout Kansas as a place of quality livestock and fair dealing. But more than that, it became known as a place of love, where a husband and wife worked side by side as true partners, where children were raised with both discipline and affection, where anyone in need could find help. Katherine never forgot those dark days as a captive, but they faded into memory rather than nightmare. Sometimes she'd wake at night and reach for Wyatt, needing to feel his solid presence to reassure herself that she was safe, that she was home. And he was always there, always ready to hold her, to whisper reassurances, to prove through his presence that the nightmare was over and the dream was real. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Wyatt surprised Katherine with a trip back to his old mountain cabin. They left the children with their hired man and his wife and rode into the high country together, retracing the path they'd taken all those years ago. The cabin was still there, weathered but intact, and they spent 3 days in that small space, making love and talking and remembering. "Do you miss it?" Katherine asked, watching him stare out at the mountains he'd once called home. "This solitary life?" Wyatt considered the question seriously before answering. "I miss the simplicity sometimes, the quiet. But no, I don't miss the loneliness. I didn't realize how lonely I was until I had you to come home to. These mountains are beautiful, but they're just scenery now. Home is wherever you are." "Sentimental fool," Katherine teased, though her eyes were bright with tears. "You're sentimental fool," Wyatt corrected, pulling her into his arms. "Now and always." More years passed, bringing joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. James fell in love with a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, and married her in a ceremony that reminded Katherine of her own simple wedding. Sarah showed an unexpected talent for numbers and business, eventually taking over much of the ranch's financial management. Katherine and Wyatt became grandparents, then grandparents several times over, their house filling with the laughter of grandchildren during holidays and special occasions. Through it all, their love remained the foundation on which everything else was built. They still worked together daily, though with less of the physical labor and more of the planning and management. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, now with gray in their hair and lines on their faces, and talked about everything and nothing. They still reached for each other in the night, finding comfort and passion in the familiar warmth of their shared bed. On the 20th anniversary of Katherine's rescue, when she was 42 and Wyatt was 48, they rode once more to the foothills. But this time they brought their children and grandchildren, making a family camping trip of it. As Katherine watched Wyatt showing his grandson how to track deer, as she listened to Sarah telling the story of how her parents met to wide-eyed grandchildren, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. What those rustlers had meant for evil, God had turned to good. The worst experience of her life had led her to the greatest love of her life. The journey through darkness had brought her to a light brighter than she'd ever imagined possible. That night, after the children and grandchildren were asleep, Katherine and Wyatt walked a little way from the camp to watch the stars. Wyatt wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, and they stood like that for a long time, in comfortable silence. "Thank you," Katherine said finally. "For what?" Wyatt asked, though she could hear the smile in his voice. "For being brave enough to come down from your mountain, for tracking me through wild country and risking your life to save mine, for staying when it would have been easier to leave, for loving me all these years, for giving me this beautiful life, these incredible children and grandchildren, for everything." Wyatt turned her in his arms so he could look down into her face. Even in the moonlight, he could see every line, every gray hair, every sign of the years they'd shared. And she was still the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Thank you for being brave enough to see past my scars and fears," he replied, "for refusing to let me run when I was afraid, for building this life with me, for giving me a family and a home and a purpose, for loving me even when I didn't think I deserved to be loved. You saved me, Katherine, just as much as I saved you that day. Maybe more." "We saved each other," Katherine said softly. "That's what love does." "Yes," Wyatt agreed. "That's exactly what love does." He kissed her then, long and sweet under the stars, and Katherine thought about how that first kiss on the ranch porch 20 years ago had led to this moment, to this life, to this perfect fullness of heart. The fire crackled in the camp behind them, and they could hear one of the grandchildren laughing at something in their sleep. Somewhere a coyote called, and another answered. The mountains rose dark against the star-studded sky, and the prairie stretched endlessly before them. It was all so beautiful, so perfect, so exactly right. Hand in hand, they walked back to their family, to the life they'd built together from the ashes of trauma and the seeds of love. And as they settled into their bedrolls, Katherine's head on Wyatt's shoulder and his arms wrapped protectively around her even in sleep, they both knew that this was what happily ever after looked like. Not a fairy tale ending with trumpets and fanfare, but something better, something real. A love hard-won and carefully tended, a partnership forged in fire and strengthened by time. Children and grandchildren, laughter and tears, work and rest, sorrow and joy, all woven together into a life neither of them had dared dream of in those dark days when she was a captive and he was alone on his mountain. But dreams, they'd learned, didn't always look like you expected. Sometimes they looked like rope burns healing under gentle hands. Sometimes they looked like a mountain man learning to smile again. Sometimes they looked like a stubborn woman refusing to let love slip away. Sometimes they looked like two broken people finding wholeness in each other. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, dreams looked exactly like this: a warm fire, a sleeping family, and the steady heartbeat of the person you loved most in the world, promising without words that tomorrow would come and you'd face it together, just as you'd faced everything else. Together. Always together. That was the promise they'd made and kept for 20 years. and it was the promise they'd keep for all the years to come, however many or few those might be. Because that was what love meant, not the absence of struggle or sorrow, but the presence of someone who would stand beside you through all of it. The Rustlers had taken Katherine planning to sell her across the border, but a mountain man had crossed every border that mattered, physical and emotional, and brought her home, not just to her ranch but to herself. And in doing so, he'd found his own way home too. That was the real story. Not just of rescue, though that had been part of it, but of two lost souls finding each other in the wilderness and building something beautiful from the raw materials of courage and hope and stubborn, enduring love. And they lived that story every day for the rest of their lives. In the work they did together, the children they raised, the love they shared, the legacy they left. They lived it in the big moments and the small ones, in the extraordinary days and the ordinary ones. They lived it until the end of their days, and even then, the story continued in the lives of their children and grandchildren, a testament to what two people could build when they chose love over fear, together over alone, hope over despair. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it, and that, Katherine and Wyatt would have told you with absolute certainty, was what made it a story worth telling.